Chapter 25 focuses on World War One, and we're going to start out with the causes. The immediate cause was basically considered to be the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was assassinated by a Serbian terrorist, and Serbia is right over here. It is considered a part of the Balkans or Eastern Europe. And here's Bosnia. And Serbia and Bosnia were both kind of under the control of Austria, or at least Bosnia was. And Serbians were sympathetic to Bosnians who wanted to be independent, right? There were these nationalist movements occurring. And so this Serbian terrorist named Gavrilo Princip took it upon himself to strike back at the Austrian government by assassinating Franz Ferdinand. As a result of that, Austria will declare war on Serbia in 1914, and then you have this domino effect where Russia will side with Serbia and then declare war on Austria, and then that's followed by a German declaration of war on Russia. But really, what kind of gets the world closer to war is, not that we blame either side, but both Germany and Russia we're already mobilizing troops after Austria declares war. So it's almost as though they were, not looking for a fight, but they were really preparing. And then once the Austrians kind of attacked the Serbians, that's when kind of Russia made their declaration. So this is more of an immediate cause. So you want to be able to kind of summarize the long-term causes. Well, how did we get to the assassination? And the acronym MAIN is a good way to remember it. So it's militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Those are all the main factors. That's, it's kind of like there was no, each, for example, militarism, right? So during the Industrial Revolution, obviously one, I guess, negative effect would be the building up of modern militaries. And that was done for defense, but it actually kind of became almost a competition between the European countries who could have the most powerful military. They would, it was almost like a festive competition, and to show off their strength. And so, really, what it does is it kind of, it was very different back then. War was almost honorable. It was almost, people almost wanted to go to war to defend themselves or defend their beliefs. And remember, war up to that point wasn't as deadly as war would be during this war and then going forward. So I think that by building up those militaries, you kind of were instigating or again, kind of pushing your people towards that. So knowing that your enemy has this building military, you might join an alliance. And that's what we see as the formation of alliances for self-defense. So England, Britain, and Russia were on the Allied Alliance, or in the Allied Alliance, and the Entente was made up of Austria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. So they were kind of one alliance. And again, it's in response to this growing threat that these countries faced due to militarism. Imperialism, obviously, it's all about competing, and here's another aspect, right? Who has the most colonies? Colonization was a sign of power, and these countries, obviously, especially, Germany, if you defeat the French, you gain their colonies. So war had kind of an economic motivation, right? You could win and gain these colonies. So I think when there was the opportunity to go to war, perhaps the thought of gaining colonies might have helped justify that war, for example. Nationalism, again, contributed to the spark. National pride, obviously having that army, having those colonies, and just basically believing, Germans believing they were the superior nation in Europe, again, helped intensify support for war. So it wasn't hard for the German government to elicit the support of the people. They believed it would be, honorable to defend their country and to show the world how superior they were. And even within these empires, you had nationalist movements growing that contributed to, obviously, the war. So the Serbian and Bosnian national movements inspired Gavrilo Princip to assassinate the Austrian Archduke. And these colonial peoples, or these ethnic groups that wanted independence, were seeking something called self-determination. That's a good term to remember. And basically, it's the idea that people of the same ethnicity, language, culture, and political ideas seek to be, united and eventually have the right to form their own nation. We see that in the Ottoman Empire with Arab people, and again, we see that among Serbians and Bosnians to get out of the control, the grip of the Austrian government. All right, so and it could be a question on the exam, and again, it connects to, the context would be the industrial era, right? So one negative aspect of industrialism would be the advancements in war. And poison gas was a new weapon. Machine guns were new weapons, or at least, more innovative or modern machine guns, submarines, tanks, all sorts of new weaponry, the artillery cannons. And this basically changed the face of war. Probably made war less honorable going forward after the destruction that people realized these weapons caused. To kind of survive the onslaught of these new weapons, the strategy during World War I was to build trenches. If you took my course freshman year, if you remember, we kind of reenacted trench warfare. But the idea was, basically save yourself from poison gas and machine gun fire and artillery cannon fire by digging deep into a trench. And the idea would be to kind of outlast the enemy, right? And this was a war of attrition. The winner would be the alliance or the side that had the fewest deaths and casualties. So because of the warfare, really stalemates were common. It was very, an opposing side would maybe gain a couple of miles over the course of a few months. So, battles were not very easy to win. The Allies won their share, as did the other side, the Central Powers. But more often than not, the battles resulted in basically no one winning, and basically the result was destruction. The U.S. enters war actually in almost the last year of war. They were neutral from 1914 to 1917. The war was not very popular. A lot of Americans didn't think it was really justifiable to go aid countries far, far away. But that's going to end in 1918 for a variety of factors. The Zimmerman Note was considered the spark. The Germans and the Mexicans engage in a treaty where the Germans promised to help the Mexicans regain Texas and other land lost throughout history. And in return, the Mexican government would support, that would tie up the United States if Mexico were to basically invade the United States. The telegraph never, Zimmerman was the ambassador. The telegraph never made it to the Mexicans. The English actually intercepted it. It was revealed to our government, and that was pretty much the next step was pretty much declaration of war. Also, German U-boat attacks were a problem throughout the period. American merchant ships were sunk. Trade goods were lost at sea when English merchant ships were sunk. So Woodrow Wilson kind of argues in his declaration of war that the right to trade or rights were under attack. So there was an economic component to it. But again, I think the Zimmerman Note was really the straw that broke the camel's back. It was seen as really an attack on American, on America. The Russian Revolution also occurs during this time, and this is actually really important. And it's a pretty simple revolution to understand. So remember, at the beginning of the war, Russia was ruled by a czar, right? An autocrat, almost a monarch, Tsar Nicholas. It wasn't democratic in any way. Owners of business had a lot of influence. So, Marxism began to take hold in Russia. People were frustrated with the war and how much devastation there was. Government was mismanaging things, and there were food and fuel shortages that led to uprising. And eventually, the Tsar and the government was overthrown. That was the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas follows Alexander. And what was actually put in place was a more of a traditional, not traditional, but a government that was at least friendly to the United States. It was a government that was more democratic, comprised of liberals, socialists, conservatives, but it wasn't doing enough. And as a result of that, the Soviets, these were socialists who kind of were looking to even overthrow that government. And eventually, the socialists um, who were in power were eventually take over, and those socialists were known as Bolsheviks. They were led by Vladimir Lenin. Here he is. He was a Marxist. He was a believer in Marx's philosophy, and he basically does what Marx recommended: a violent overthrow by the proletariat class, proletariat class, an overthrow of the owners, right? The capitalist system. The socialists, the Soviets. That was the name of these socialists. They also called them the Bolshevik Party. Basically, the communists promised peace, land, and bread, and they established what will be known going forward as the Soviet Union, the USSR. I forget what the letters mean. I know socialist is in there, and republic. I think United too. Um, but they take over. The provisional liberal government is no longer, and the United States isn't too thrilled with that. They were kind of allying themselves with that new government. They saw some duality, and as a result of that, basically Lenin and the Bolsheviks pull Russia out of the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ends Russians' participation in the war in 1918. That really hurt the Allied forces. Fortunately, the U.S. was entering as well. That kind of took over for the Russians, or they took over for the Russians. They did have to give up a lot of land, including the Ukraine. That was part of the deal. And basically, Germany promised to leave Russia alone, the Soviet Union alone, and that allowed the Bolsheviks to pretty much build a communist state. Interesting, people don't realize this. We actually went to war with Russia in 1920. Anti-communist forces led by the French, the English, and the U.S. after World War One went after Lenin, but we were unable to overthrow him. So, in a little known fact, we have been to war with Russia and the communists directly. All right, so World War One was known as a total war. It was considered a total war, and what that means is basically that um, all resources were contributed to the war or committed to the war, and that includes people. So, for example, all civilians in the United States were participating, whether it was working in factories, women, um, African Americans moving north for jobs in factories. Maybe families were conserving food. Um, Perhaps you were buying war bonds, you were loaning money to the government. All sorts of great examples of that. Also, the government took a hands-on approach to the economy. So, for example, the government would kind of control production, or at least, oversee production. Now, companies didn't complain because they were, making a lot of money, but the government did oversee how much these, factories were making. They would actually control prices to prevent inflation. They would make sure that workers were being paid an adequate wage so that workers wouldn't go on strike and disrupt the production of armaments. They would require Americans to ration food. Meatless Mondays, where you couldn't eat meat maybe on Mondays. Gasless Wednesdays, where you couldn't fuel up your car, perhaps. And also censorship. Woodrow Wilson limited free speech with the Sedition Act, where, if you recall, we studied this freshman year, where if you criticized the war effort, you would go to jail. And many Americans were jailed because of that, especially labor unions, for the most part, of the entire war. So, good example, and be able to kind of articulate that. Evidence of total war. And this was the case for World War II as well, definitely. So this is going to continue in the next war. Conservation of food, I'm not sure if I mentioned that. People were encouraged to grow their own gardens, right? To compensate for, say, the rationing of food. All right, propaganda was also very important, mostly in the form of posters, songs perhaps. Again, we studied this freshman year. And again, the purpose of a propaganda poster, for example, would be to influence the people of a country and elicit support for the war, mostly, right? Get people to join, encourage people to ration food. And a lot of times it would sometimes just to eliminate dissent. They'd have patriotic themes to make Americans feel patriotic and encourage them to support the war, even if they weren't sure about it, right? So those are all great examples of the purpose of propaganda. Tools. What did the propagandists use to kind of manipulate people, mostly demonizing the enemy? This was a famous poster where Germany was portrayed as King Kong, right, a gorilla. There's Lady Liberty in his grasp, right? And if you notice the culture here, right, Kultur, right, German culture is the bat, and here he is in America, and the purpose to encourage men to enlist in the army. Truths were exaggerated. German soldiers were not any worse off than any other soldiers in terms of how they treated civilians. Sometimes, again, you'd have posters of soldiers or songs that would elicit, that would be patriotic in theme to make you, want to serve your country or support your country. So definitely be familiar with some of those tools. I think demonizing the enemy is the one that I remember. Again, portraying the evil German soldier as a deadly gorilla. All right, so World War I was a global war. Obviously, everyone was fighting. England was, throughout the war, they would, as they suffered victory, as they won certain battles, they would seize German colonies. They had to defend the Suez Canal from attack from the Ottoman Empire. So England was fighting all over the place. England would use African and Indian soldiers. The idea would be, Indian soldiers believed that if they were loyal to the crown, that they perhaps at the end of war would gain freedom. Arabs too were promised self-rule if they too, supported the Ottoman Empire. So that was, kind of something that was used. Unfortunately, these groups didn't achieve that at the end of war, but they were kind of hopeful that would happen. The French recruited Vietnamese soldiers. Again, those Vietnamese soldiers, led by Ho Chi Minh, who was the communist leader down the road, they too hoped that they would get self-rule when the war was over with, as kind of payment. World War I was the most, up to that point, was the deadliest war the world had ever seen. Millions of soldiers were killed, millions of civilian casualties as well. France was just completely torn apart. Many of the battles were fought in France. And there was also a genocide. People kind of overlooked this genocide, but the Ottoman Empire went after the Christian peoples. They were under, there was tolerance for many years, but that would change over time. And these Christians were massacred. It was, the government alleged that they were just helping Russia, but many of these Christians were deported to camps in Iraq and Syria, and many died of starvation and disease. So, I think we know about the Holocaust in Europe. We're going to learn about the Rwandan massacres in Africa in the 90s, but we sometimes forget about the Christian Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, who were also devastated by the Ottoman government. There was also a plague known as the influenza pandemic, and it was pretty much because soldiers were returning home with this disease. It's great that we can travel across the Atlantic Ocean, but unfortunately, that's going to spread pandemics, right? And 20 million people in Europe and the U.S. were killed because of it, and 7 million died in India. So a devastating disease that resulted in some terrible tragedy. I'm not sure if they were 20 million deaths. I'd have to look at that, but 20 million people were affected by this pandemic. All right, the Treaty of Versailles. So at the end of war, eventually Germany agrees to not a surrender, but they agree to stop fighting. They were pretty much, when the United States came in, the U.S. was fresh. That tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. The Germans, though, at the end, when the powers came to Versailles, France, to negotiate a peace treaty. Germany was pretty much blamed for everything. They had to pay, millions of dollars, perhaps billions in reparation. Again, they pretty much lost the war. Again, they didn't surrender, but they agreed to stop fighting. But they were pretty much wiped out militarily, and the Allies kind of had them, had them by the neck. Germany had to give up all their colonial possessions and disarm their military. And because of that, the German people, they didn't forget that. Hitler was actually a soldier during World War One. Unfortunately, he survived, but he rose to power. And one of the selling points was that he would regain, British, German glory and go after the powers that crushed Germany. So that's an important piece to remember. Those colonial possessions, by the way, those colonies weren't given independence. They were just basically carved up by the French and the British. The League of Nations emerges. Woodrow Wilson actually had a 14-point peace proposal that was pretty much disregarded. He called for an end of colonization, limits on militaries. None of those were accepted. The French and the English wanted to maintain their power, their militaries, their colonies, but they wanted to obviously weaken Germany and Austria. But one part that came was the League of Nations, kind of an early United Nations. The U.S. refused to be a part of it. They believed it would just drag them back into another war. Germany was also not allowed to be a part of it. It was a post-war alliance, a great example of that. It was, again, designed to keep the peace. It was ineffective. The U.S. was not a part of it. Germany and Italy walked all over it, as did Japan. So in the end, it was a failure, but it would give way to the United Nations, which obviously exists today. Okay, so it's kind of Woodrow Wilson's one of his great accomplishments. And again, it was one of the 14 points that made its way to the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so what were the overall effects? The people of India didn't initially get freedom. Neither did the people of Vietnam, but it energized nationalist movements. So eventually the people of India, led by Gandhi, would rise up and they would gain their independence. Vietnam, the people of northern Vietnam, would initiate a communist rebellion led by Ho Chi Minh, and they too would be victorious in the 70s. Again, the colonies were providing that support and that loyalty during the war. They were hoping that they would get that freedom as a reward, but it didn't happen. Another part of Wilson's 14 points, he encouraged self-determination, letting these ethnic groups, have their freedom. Again, that didn't happen, but it's something that would occur eventually over the course of time. One reason why the people of India maybe were confident enough, and Vietnam were confident enough to rise up against England and France, was because they recognized that during this war, England and France kind of got beat pretty bad, and that they were not invincible. Their militaries were weakened. The people of France didn't have a taste of war. So eventually, by the 40s and 50s, at least in Vietnam, we're going to see a rebellion take place. Again, the Treaty of Versailles did not address decolonization. It only inspired, but it did inspire, the people of India to rise up, and eventually they did. So the mandate system was very important. Actually, I would remember this. After World War I, when the Allies began to carve up the German and Austrian and Ottoman colonies, they used the mandate system to kind of justify that. And the people of England and France believed that the colonies or the colonized people needed tutelage and guidance, that they weren't ready for self-determination or independence. So the League of Nations placed all the Arab states, which were Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, that were under the Ottoman Empire, under actually British and French control. And that really angered the Arab people, who again were fighting in the war. They gave their lives and their efforts to the empire, and they didn't get that self-determination. So that's going to lead to the Arabism movement, and it basically was a nationalist movement, and the goal was to unite North Africa and Afghanistan. Okay, so it's a It's an Arab movement. Obviously, these are Muslim countries, but it wasn't about spreading Islam. It was about seeking independence for Arab people in this region. And here is the mandate system. So again, Syria was given to the French. Iraq was given to the Brits. India, Iran did become an independent nation. Palestine, right here. Again, the people of Palestine today, Palestine would include Israel. They were under British control, and Saudi Arabia became an independent nation, as did and Lebanon was part of the Republic of Turkey, which obviously exists today. So again, the Ottoman Empire was broken up into these mandates that were now governed by the French and the British. All right, the Balfour Declaration, another important foreign peace. 1917, the Jews, remember Zionists, were seeking a homeland for Jews. Basically, this declaration established Palestine as a home for them. The only problem with that is Palestine was also the home of Muslim Arabs, so that didn't go over very well. Palestine was mostly Sunni, and that would, even though the state of Israel wasn't created yet, the land was established, and after World War II, Israel would be created, or a Jewish state. So really, from 1917 on, you're going to have a lot of tensions in this region between Jews and Arab Palestinians, which still continues today. All right, what about Asia? There were also some nationalist movements in Asia. In 1919, the people of Korea began to protest against Japanese imperialism. It was known as the March First movement. They were frustrated with, again, Japan's hold on Korea. Remember, Japan gained hold of Korea after the Japanese-Russo War. So the people of Korea wanted independence. They didn't get it until after World War II, but there was a movement occurring. The May 4th movement in China was another nationalist movement. The people of China were concerned about Japan's claim to Germany's influence. So remember, Germany had a spear of China that they maybe didn't govern, but had a lot of trade rights in. They were maybe were living there. So when Germany was defeated, Japan wanted that area. England and France sided with Japan, and that frustrated the people of China, who demonstrated in 1919. And what it is, it's an example of this growing national movement where the Chinese were looking to expel foreigners, in a sense. And eventually that's going to lead to a communist revolution in the 50s, where the Chinese will begin to reject Western-style governments, and they're going to push China towards a Marxist model. So again, more change in China, and the common theme is rejecting Westernization, in this case, democracy. And eventually, again, leaders of the May 4th movement joined the Communist Party. And I believe in the after World War II, we're going to see a communist revolution in China led by Mao Zedong. So overall, what were the trends after World War I? That's an important period of time. What happens after? Well, you're going to have, again, growing nationalist and decolonization movements. The people of India rise up and kick England out. The growth of communism in China, Cuba, also in Vietnam, and North Korea, right? The emergence of fascism. Hitler was a fascist. Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, was a fascist. We'll get into what that term means. But basically, these are totalitarian rulers who basically, controlled the freedoms of the people in return for protection and glory. But again, we'll get more into the definition of fascism. And in the United States and all over the world, we're going to see anti-immigrant sentiment emerge in the 20s and 30s. All right. Culturally, there were some changes after war. Basically, it was a depressive era in a sense. People were very frustrated, fearful, dismayed. The war was horrible on many levels, and that led to the lost generation. It was a generation of writers, musicians, artists whose stories and paintings kind of expressed the frustration and dismay of society. People had lost a sense of security and hope. Ernest Hemingway was a famous Lost Generation writer. If you've ever heard of his stories, probably one of our greatest writers. The Old Man and the Sea, A Farewell to Arms. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. You've read that, right? He's, again, part of this lost generation of writers. And again, they were describing this or representing this suffering generation. So again, cultural changes in addition to the economic and political changes that were occurring. That's it, guys.